upcoming election on August 4th, where Kansans will be voting yes or no to change how the state elects judges. Tonight, a former Supreme Court Chief Justice visited Salina to talk about why he believes you should vote no. Sophia Granader joining us with more on that. Sophia.
Rachel, Lawton Nuss served on the Kansas Supreme Court, eventually becoming Chief Justice in 2010. He was in Salina tonight saying he believes you should vote no on this amendment. He doesn't want donors to spend money on judicial candidates. But I also spoke with a Kansas attorney who is one of 58 attorneys in favor of this amendment.
We need to stop billionaire political donors from turning our impartial justices into politicians for sale.
That's Lawton Nuss, former Chief Justice of the Kansas Supreme Court, speaking in Salina on Wednesday. He's encouraging Kansans to vote no on an amendment that would change how the state elects judges.
It was still up to me to get better qualified.
Nuss is explaining how he was appointed to the Kansas Supreme Court. Currently, judges are appointed by a nomination commission consisting of attorneys.
I was chosen by the same Bill Graves who had rejected me just 2 years earlier.
If Kansans vote yes, the system will be replaced with an election where all Kansans can vote.
This proposed constitutional amendment does away with all this that I just went through.
Mike Patton disagrees with Nuss. He's one out of 58 attorneys who signed this letter encouraging Kansans to vote yes. He says people who want to become judges will pitch themselves to the commission.
These candidates will send letters, they'll make phone calls, and that is a process that is completely opaque or completely invisible to the public.
People like Nuss believe a direct election will allow wealthy donors to influence judicial candidates. But Patton says most judges already have political biases. Changing the system just means everyone would know about those biases instead of a few attorneys.
It's moving power from a select few to a broad, popular voting system, which I believe in.
55 out of 105 counties in Kansas already elect their own judges, including here in Sedgwick County.